getting the sign. All right, I'm presenting and recording, and welcome everyone. Please make sure your attendance is in chat. I see a few folks have joined us. So the topic for today, and I believe it's chapter 13, is restoration ecology. And it's usually something that is more favored by a live meeting, because this is something that is just dear to the heart of conservationists. You know, we've talked this semester about the science perspective and the social perspective on everything. And I think this semester, with the COVID-19 virus being so affecting our lives on an everyday basis, you can kind of see the gap, the distinction. So the initial concern with it and the initial alarm is dying down, and it looks like we're going to just reopen business as usual. That probably means the society's willing to accept a 5% mortality rate as our experiencing the virus and our gaining herd immunity for the population progresses. I'm kind of hoping for an early development on a vaccine, which would take those numbers and place them more under control. But right now, who knows? I think people are getting tired of the science numbers and hearing the data all the time, even though they're valid, and they're making social decisions. So in the field of ecology and of conservation, this idea of restoration follows right on the heels of a lot of the scientific analysis that has been done. Humans use resources, and they should. Humans need to survive and reproduce just like every other species. Often, though, if you look at the way we do that, it is not the most efficient way. Traditional methods of ranking the economic value of a resource, like forests or fisheries, was that it was vast and it would never be depleted, and therefore we should just give the resources, the trees and the fish, away. But we got actually so efficient at harvesting that we now can envision a day where major forests are just altered and gone, where fisheries are depleted to the point of exhaustion. There was a time historically when we wrote about the Grand Banks, and they are a fishery off of Maine and Newfoundland in the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. And accounts of the cod fishery there were that the fish were so dense that they were right at the surface and crowded together so closely that it looked like you could walk across their backs across the surface of the water. And that was the days of the sailing ships, when lots of fishermen were fishing hand lines, and those that had nets were not able to troll them at will, so the wind kind of determined what you could do in terms of catching fish. But the internal combustion motor, well, I guess steam first, and then the internal combustion motor, and our advances in fisheries and in netting methods became so efficient that we depleted the Grand Banks to the point of exhaustion just before World War II. Now, World War II, with its hostilities, had a very strong impact on fisheries. And in those 4 to 5 years of war, the fishing industry was not able to fish so rigorously, and the Grand Banks kind of recovered. But after the war, with our super trawlers and the 3-mile limit no longer keeping, protecting something like the Grand Banks, and international fishing fleets were sent out from countries that had depleted the stocks near their shorelines. And as a result, the Grand Banks crashed. They were closed for a period of about 15 years and recovered to a point where we could allow structured fishing, sustainable fishing. And that's actually to everyone's interest. That's actually a terrible story that it took us so long to respond. But it's a good story in terms of our management. The resource is back and being used in a sustainable way. Not that there aren't still arguments and still resentments and bad stories, I would say. So restoration ecology, as presented by your textbook, is going to basically look at what does it take to recover the ecology of a depleted or damaged region. It's good for our economics because although we still need the resource, to deplete it to the point of exhaustion is bad business. Prairies and grasslands will take on a special focus, along with some of the wetlands and forests and the truly unique places in the United States. Each one of them has a story of colonization by primarily European peoples. And the reason I mention those is that the technology in Europe, the medicine in Europe, the weapons in Europe were well developed beyond those of native peoples. And so they sort of overwhelmed the native peoples, and the colonization by Caucasians from Europe basically began this pattern of more efficient harvest, more efficient agriculture, more extensive. You could get more work done. You could get more harvest. You could export your surplus and get money back for it. And that free enterprise, that capitalism, combined with that idea of good old Yankee ingenuity and making your way and building your empire, all sort of had a overriding effect on the ecology of our country. Ecological restoration is recognizing what you mean by degradation, what you mean by a native ecosystem. And if thinking back to the previous chapters, what did we have? We had definitions of species like flagship species, keystone species, endangered species. All of these definitions recognize the idea that things are changing. Pre-human and post-human colonization. I have a particular preference. I think there's a language we use that's damaging to our approach to ecological preservation, ecological restoration. And we say, is that natural or is that man-made? I don't like that because it takes human beings out of nature. And when we talk about nature, we seem to be talking about everything but us. But we're a biological species. What we do with the environment and with our resources is, not qualitatively different than what other species do. But quantitatively, our ability to mass our harvest and sell it for money has led to a pattern of industry that is just unparalleled. So the ideal of an original pristine condition is actually a kind of a dream. It's a nice dream, but usually it is not reachable. Usually when you make changes, some of those are functionally irreversible. And when you look at a forest restoration, if you cut down a primary forest, the stability of that climax forest has been established by decades to centuries of growth and balance. And when you introduce a new factor like human beings who are building, who are changing, who are diverting, going back to the pre-human condition is just not ever going to be achieved. The question I always have is, why do we have to change it all? I think Teddy Roosevelt, and I've said this before, Teddy Roosevelt was a visionary. And he said, I don't care, I'm going to back a federal effort to set aside national parks. And we made a real effort. The popular parks are those that set aside something for human wonder and human enjoyment. That that are unparalleled in terms of their land feature. Yellowstone Park is a hot spot that's moving, but it's under land. That's unknown anywhere in the world. So all that volcanic activity, all of that hot springs, you can't see it anywhere else in the world. The Everglades as a vast lowland swamp. The Grand Canyon is unparalleled. And so the initial park efforts were for that novelty, the wonder of just seeing something that's unique. How far we should go in preserving national parks kind of depends on the resource. Sequoia National Park is something that I've visited, both of the areas, which are the major concentration of the sequoia redwood trees. And it is a wonder to behold them, to see a tree that large and that old. They exist only because they were conserved. So when we talk about restoration, look at all of the factors that we have to take into consideration. Begin with the straight line descent. When pristine ecosystems are in some way disturbed, meaning they're being changed in a way that's not elastic. It's not going to be a seasonal change that rebounds. Seasonal change and not an oscillation. It's actually a change where you can identify the use and even the destruction of the resource. It can be established in alternative steady states. So for example, if you have a pristine forest, or what we call a primary forest, you can go in and cut lumber from that forest. And there's a wonderful program in Missouri that was the vision of a single man, lived in St. Louis, named Leo Dry. Until recently, it was commonly stated, and it was true, Leo Dry was the largest landowner in Missouri. And he went around to areas which had well-developed forest. Mature white oak forest was his favorite. And he bought up land. And his purpose was to preserve forests, but he developed a system of sustainable agriculture. Sustainable forestry. He went in and he logged his acres, but he cut selectively and always with attention to the age structure of the trees that were there, the replanting of trees when trees were removed. And although he could have made a lot more money by clear cutting it, he basically has preserved a forest that you can see in Missouri that is close to the pristine ecosystem, has elements of it that are exactly the same as the pristine ecosystem, but I want to emphasize it's an alternative steady state, and one that I think is quite admirable. It takes into account people's need for lumber, and it also takes into account the values beyond economic of the forest itself. We see from alternative steady states, if the disturbances continue, and especially if you have a value of complete production for maximum profit, this ecosystem is generally called degraded. So there's no real argument that the prairies of the United States are among the most altered ecosystems that we have. You go into the prairie, and the nice thing is it's covered with grass and herbs. You don't actually have to dig out a bunch of stumps in order to make an agricultural field. You simply turn the soil over. But in doing so, we've gone to monoculture in agriculture. So if you've ever driven across Kansas in late May, early June, all the way, depending on what part of Kansas you're in, all the way to the wheat harvest, you simply see field after field after field that's solid wheat. The prairie is not there anymore. It's been removed. It is, with respect to the natural ecosystem, a barren site. It's being used for agriculture, and I have no argument with that. But we are now seeing vast tracts of native grassland that are being preserved as examples and as, I would say, reservoirs of biodiversity. This is all to the good. If you want to counter this descent, the straight line through the middle of this, you can take a number of different approaches. You can look at your resource and species management and restore in the broad sense, try to achieve an alternative steady state. I would actually say that the national parks are good examples of alternative steady states. The national parks are there for public use and public enjoyment. There's no way you could call Yellowstone or Grand Canyon, Sequoia, or Everglades pristine, because we've arranged them so that people can use them and enjoy them. If you do restoration in the strict sense, and restoration in the strict sense means you buy the land and you exclude human uses. This is the approach of the Nature Conservancy. Nature Conservancy is there to conserve lands, and when they buy it, they remove it from human use. Now, I think their position, which was an absolute position and very popular when they were, when Nature Conservancy originated, is beginning to moderate somewhat. That they realize that that strict sense restoration is very slow and probably not practical. But that's something for a future determination. On the right side of the diagram, you see a number of terms that are used. You can, from a barren side, you can reallocate it to new uses. You basically can say restoration is not practical here, but let's use it in a smarter way. From degraded ecosystems, you can intervene and try some reintroduction. Sometimes the reintroduction of key plants and key animals, microorganisms, will restore the recovery and speed it because of the natural interactions that work so well on that site. Now, those ecosystems will be simplified, the issue here of invasive species is very important. Do you already have on that site invasive species that were introduced and now are going to interfere permanently with native species? That's something that is difficult to deal with. And here in the state of Missouri, and especially the location we have at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, the water invasives like the zebra mussel, like the species of carp that are abundant now in all of our waterways, illustrate this issue of alien species. So if you have a simplified ecosystem, you can do reallocation to a novel ecosystem, some new formulation that recognizes the the plus human influences. Let's call it that. The natural ecosystem after you add humans to the natural mix. We're part of the natural picture. Or you can basically make the decision to try and rehabilitate that to an alternative steady state. So all of these terms kind of illustrate different approaches. Rehabilitation is repair. Reintroduction will be recognizing what's gone and bringing it back. Remediation kind of goes deeper. If you have to remove pollutants from the mud of the riverbed, or you have to in some way address air quality, or a particular poisoning like the tailings of lead mines that are releasing lead into the groundwater, then that's remediation. Reclamation, generally you're trying to take a severely degraded situation and clean it up and return it as close as you can to the original biodiversity. Mitigation is actually trading human uses, which would be called degrading to the ecosystem, for the preservation of sites that have not yet been entered by human development. So it's the economic model is mitigation. If you want to do this, then you have to compensate the world, by that I mean the citizens of the world, for your excessive degradation or pollution. We'll look at some examples of that as we go on. This requires everything we know about everything, so that I'd like to just kind of give an example of one that's become the bad boy of personal hygiene use, and that's Freon. When people were developing unguents and lotions and sprays, pump bottles actually deliver them just fine, but somehow pressurized cans with gas pressure that pushes it out in a finer mist, it would aerosol and goes on, I think, covers the surface in a better way than a pump bottle. And they were very popular with people. So industry began looking for a gas, a propellant that was ecologically responsible. And if you go back and you look at the history of the identification of Freon and of PP, the propellants of aerosol cans, there was more time and more money put into that than most ingredients of our daily use products. And it was found to be absolutely safe in testing. So it was approved by all of the relevant associations, and we got these aerosol cans. Now, at that point, there was something we didn't really anticipate. And when you're designing, when you're asking a question about this propellant gas, can we use it as a propellant? Is it really your responsibility to think, what if it rises through the atmosphere and changes the ozone that is a part of our layering and our protection from UV light? That's actually such an extreme possibility. It wasn't even imagined. And so industry did not actually conceive of it until it started happening. So I would like to say that, you know, those propellants were researched with good faith, and the results, they selected the propellant that gave the best results. But something we didn't know kind of ambushed that attempt. But the best laid plans of mice and men go off to stray is very applicable here. It wasn't that industry was negligent. They did everything they could have done. But something we didn't know kind of turned around and rendered that research unimportant. So when we look at restoration projects, the common elements are what is causing the degradation? What's the science? What about invasive species? Sometimes they come in accidentally and naturally. Accidentally meaning that the person who transported them wasn't really trying to bring them in. Other times it's very deliberate. When you colonize, you tend to see the successful elements of your society going back to their homeland and bringing those things with them that they identify as being part of their heritage. So this was a problem in the United States with plants and animals. It was a problem especially in Australia. Australia had a mammal population that was unique on the surface of the earth in that it was made of marsupials, pouched animals, and no internal gestation, no placental mammals were present. So when placental mammals began to be introduced, first, let me talk about the ones who were introduced on purpose. The English colonists wanted rabbits to hunt and wanted foxes to hunt. And they basically came in and did their part in devastating that part of the mammalian population. But in the colonization, they also introduced things like rats and mongooses and cane toads, often for specific reasons. But each one of them had a terrible effect on the marsupials. Replanting, of course, is just bringing back in the genetic stock. So if you restore a prairie, an agriculture area by planting prairie grasses, you can envision a time where your children or grandchildren would see a prairie functioning back on that area. Captive breeding and reestablishing fauna is much more complicated and much more expensive, but it is in fact the focused program of zoos and aquariums. So they not only have animals to display to the public, They have developed breeding programs with the target of maintaining the genetic and demographic stability of that captive population. Now, the leap to reestablishing fauna in nature, reintroducing those offspring, has been a very thorny problem. It has not been done successfully on a broad scale. And in fact, every one of the reintroductions that I know is successful in reestablishing a limited number in nature, which always kind of seem to be hanging on by a thread. Wolves reintroduced into Yellowstone was something that has been long studied and long admired, even though the controversy around wolves in the Yellowstone area continues to be with us. But the interesting thing about that is that wolves began preying on populations of elk, moose, and deer that were essentially out of control and unregulated. And as a result, rangers and conservations in Yellowstone are reporting a return to natural vegetation, since these herbivores are no longer present in excessive numbers. The natural vegetation is being restored. Conservationist names you should know: Gifford Pinchot was the first head of the Forest Service. He basically was that first person who wrote it down and directed the government towards science-based management. The government of the United States is always politically affected, and those people who are concerned with that science versus social junction will always try to move toward an objective point of view where you can establish actual findings that are more reliable than the opinions of people with very diverse interests. So his approach to logging was one that greatly affected our Forest Service. And although it was very successful at the time, the amount of time that's gone by since then kind of makes it look a little old-fashioned, since it does focus on harvest. Aldo Leopold was a person who really emphasized restoration ecology, introduced terms like game management and conservation and land restoration. And he wrote very broadly and very popularly, creating a land ethic, with the idea that we are not just consumers of natural resources, that it is our responsibility to look at the long-term benefits, the long-term condition of the land, and to maintain it in a way that it can be ongoing in its productivity. Nature is a functioning system. Sometimes if you just recognize and stop the damage, then nature can take over and produce something that's sustainable. Vermont is a good example, and I think forestry is a good example. The forests of the United States that were vast and primary were essentially in three places when colonization from Europe began. The New England forest, which goes across into Canada, the Michigan, Wisconsin, the Great Lakes forest that goes across into Canada, and then finally the Pacific Northwest forest, temperate rainforest, that again crosses the border north. But these were vast forests, vast sources of wood products. Now, the logging industry that arrived with the colonists included something simple: metal axes. It's actually much easier to cut down a tree with a metal axe than it is with a stone-headed axe. When you translate that metal into saws and to sawmills, it becomes even more efficient. And what they actually did is they basically cut down the New England forest. There was no restraint on it. Every primary forest that had any commercial value was harvested. Now, from that beginning, in Vermont today, we have a concern for forest and forest maintenance on a sustainable basis. Basically, Vermont was cleared for sheep farming, and about 20% of the original forest remained, all of which has been altered to some degree. In if it was not clear-cut, it was substantially cherry-picked for the valuable trees and for their commercial value. Now, in Vermont today, much of the forest has been restored, although the growing period is not really restored to the original pristine condition. We do see, however, the return of significant fauna, and especially the upper levels of the feeding chain, the so-called climax species that indicate a functioning and complete ecosystem. Moose, bear, pine martens, and bobcats are all well established in Vermont today. Also, the law in Vermont requires that you have a plan and a certificate in order to cut forested areas for any reason. Native species may need help in order to reestablish. Bermuda is a good example of something where people moved in, did agriculture. There was a multicultural approach there, but they never did develop the strong legal system of surrounding territories. The Cahow bird is the national bird, and for a long time they thought it was gone. They did find some pairs due to a concerted search in the forests in 1951 and began a protection program. Now, this protection program is a great example. So since the 1950s, they have been protecting this species. And today there's about 200 birds. So I would really have enjoyed hearing there were 2,500 birds or 5,000 birds. But it took, now 60 years, 70 years to get back to 200. It reminds me of the story of our whooping crane, which was down to some dozens of individuals. And the whooping crane is a grand bird, huge wading bird. If you see it at the Aransas Pass Reserve, where they spend the winter, or if you go up to the Wood Buffalo National Park across the border of Canada and the United States, where they do their nesting. They migrate back and forth. They're so impressive. They were basically killed for their feathers largely to make and decorate ladies' hats. After a concerted breeding program, all kinds of research. So nesting pairs, a nice thing about bird nests, and this is something that is an invasive technique that actually helps reestablishment or restoration, is that a hen of any kind of bird typically lays a certain number of eggs. If the environment is well protected, the nest is not threatened, the food supply is good, a hen might lay 4 eggs in a nest. If you wait until she leaves the nest and go up there and take one, when she comes back, she'll lay another one. So it's possible to harvest extra eggs and incubate them and hatch them. But then you have the problem of, what does that chick think it is? If you raise it with people feeding it, then it gets confused about what species it is and never naturalizes. So all kinds of fostering. You've probably seen the whooping crane puppets that you can put on an arm and stand behind a sheet. You can reach in and grab a piece of food and give it to the chick, so the chick is identifying with something that looks like a whooping crane. They removed eggs from whooping crane nest and fostered them by placing them under nesting pairs of wood cranes. So there was a sort of a fostering program that successfully raised chicks. But after now nearly a century of work, the whooping crane still is in that, I think last time I heard, 100 to 200 bird level. There's the Bermuda Cahow, the national bird, examining a nest, and an alteration there. A problem with the nesting sites is that another bird, tropic birds, began invading those nestable sites, and they were of a size that they would exclude the Cahow and they couldn't nest. So these entrances were developed, and this is a principle from birdhouses. If you want to put up a birdhouse for a warbler, you basically drill the hole of the size where the warbler can get through, but things like chickadees and sparrows cannot. And the same principle applies here, a hole that's big enough for the Cahow, but not big enough for the tropic bird. And that meant more natural nest sites were successful. Forest restoration does have benefits. Clear-cut areas, the monoculture approach is being used effectively in some ways. So if you go to the south where the growing season is long, you'll see these odd forests which look like orchards. They're pine trees in the places where I've seen them, because pines grow very quickly and they have a kind of a softer wood than hardwoods. They grow faster and they have wonderful fiber for things like paper. So if you're growing a forest for paper, you basically plant it and you harvest it within 8 to 15 years. A monoculture approach. Now, if you walk through one of those forests, it does not contain the diversity of plants, and you do not find the diversity of animals that you would find in a natural environment. But in fact, this monoculture does take some of the pressure off of natural areas that remain. There is habitat for some species, so it's kind of an intermediate benefit. In Rwanda, where war is raging, we have a tremendous, during war, you can kind of see it. We're talking now about the war on coronavirus as if nothing else matters in our present day. The same kind of thing applies to wars with guns and bullets. But in the meantime, the forest that is being destroyed harbors some very, very important species like the mountain gorilla. The mountain gorilla has been constantly threatened by this war footing in Rwanda. The other thing that's been proved with the mountain gorilla and Dian Fossey's work is that tourists will pay huge amounts of money to go to that habitat and see these gorillas in nature. These gorillas are maintaining family groups and reproducing, although they're constantly subject to disturbance. The tourists do produce a level of disturbance. That's why all of the tours are guided and their behaviors are taught, tourists are taught before you actually go up to where the gorillas are. And it's considered lucky to just see some of the gorillas. That kind of ecotourism is available in Missouri around a bird species called the prairie chicken. The prairie chicken was our prairie, our grassland species, and it was a wonderful game bird and quite abundant when Europeans began traveling across and colonizing the United States. Some remnant populations of prairie chickens, sometimes only half a dozen individuals in around Coal Camp, Missouri, that's south of Sedalia over near the western border, and then a more substantial population in the prairies north of Kansas City up toward the Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas junction. Up there are guided tours where if you I think there's a lottery, you have to get a permission to buy tickets, and then you buy your tickets and you show up and you walk out to a blind in the dark before dawn when the season for prairie chicken mating is in place, and you sit there quietly and watch through a slit in the wall as the prairie chickens come out onto what's called a booming ground, and the males do their dance and make their booming calls and attract the females. That's present in northwest Missouri. Trees are really interesting. Trees create an environment that is living. So on the physical environment, the soil, the water, the air, trees are the living element that create a new habitat, a place to escape, a place to reproduce, a place to hide, a food source. In fact, trees are so large that in many places they produce a structured ecology that is vertical. So there are the species that will nest near the ground, and there are those species that nest in the top of the trees, and they understand the borders and the junction. They do improve air quality by using CO2. They do provide shade for cooling, wildlife habitat, and the subject of many, many initiatives for nationwide for the restoration of trees. This is one of the things about forest harvest. It's okay to just go in, cut down the trees, and basically leave the bare ground there to erode away. More and more regulations are suggesting or even enforcing the need to replant so that tree growth begins immediately. Planting trees are shown in this figure, and I remember as a child we noticed and celebrated Arbor Day, where the idea was that you would plant a tree to acknowledge the importance of trees to our life. Now, oak savanna is a great example of a kind of a marginal forest. Savanna has large trees, and you see this in the Serengeti, for example, in Africa, where the trees are more or less isolated with vast areas between them where the ground is covered with herbs and grasses. Very, very productive. Typically an area of seasonal rain, so you can get a growth season and a big production of biomass. Really, typically they are occupied by some of the largest herds of grazing animals found anywhere on Earth. Another thing about the oak savanna specifically is that it's fire adapted and fire maintained. In fact, there are some species where they produce seeds and hold them, not of oaks, this is a pine. There's a thing called the fire pine that will produce seeds, and the cones remain sealed with the seeds inside. And when a fire burns through, you'll see that blackened landscape where all the vegetation and all the ground load has been burned off. Typically, the fire moves so quickly that it does not kill the tree. But then 2 weeks later, all those cones pop open, and just the seeds just rain down. And the sprout of new pine trees that comes up beneath reseeds the forest. A savanna is kind of a compromise forest. If you have deep soil and wet conditions, you're going to get very dense trees like the tropical rainforest. But if you get the combinations of things you need to grow a tree, except a little limited water, you grade from dense forest like we have on our eastern border to savannas and then eventually open prairie by the time you get to our western border. Savanna restoration, this is one of the problems with maintaining grasslands or maintaining savannas, is that the natural cycle includes periodic burning. This is one of the major problems in places like California along the coast. People want to build homes in what's called the chaparral. The chaparral is that Mediterranean climate that includes 6 months of wet and cool and 6 months of very sunny and dry. So the plants are have thick cuticles. They have lots of resin. The resins are aromatics that burn very easily. So literally, if a fire starts, I've seen this happen. The bush literally, it's not like it just begins burning. It's like it explodes when the fire reaches it. So oak savanna, Wisconsin had 2 million hectares. Less than 1/100% is left. Most of Wisconsin's been altered. Because of the fire issue, it's very difficult to do even a controlled burn. You have to set the land aside. If people's homes are in the oak savanna, you can't burn among the homes. And therefore, that removing that fire element makes the oak savanna very difficult to maintain. Restoration of Prairie Grove does show a natural area rating index showing increases in numbers of species and variation. The NARI program, you can see, has developed a consistent increase in natural species. Fire is something we think of as a complete disturbance, and our natural fire control is to control every fire all the time. That's a mixed blessing. We can come out and put out this small fire today and preserve the plants that are there, but that means that the leaves that are produced this year and that fall to the ground, the branches that die and are knocked off by the wind, all of those things become a part of the ground load. So as you control every fire, you build up the fuel load that's in your ecosystem. So in a way, that controlled burn, that periodic burn, is sort of something that's keeping the fires manageable. The recent problems that we've had this year, the fires in California, we have had in my lifetime catastrophic fires in Colorado and other places in the Rocky Mountains, and of course this last summer, the fires in Australia that were uncontrolled and uncontrollable for long periods of time. Prairies are among the most desirable habitats because they're open and they're terrific for agriculture. Less than 2% of our prairie remains. We had a tremendous grassland through our Great Plains, and it grades from very different kinds of grasslands from east to west. Right on our western border, there was a tall grass prairie where the grasses would grow above 8 and 9 feet tall. We had then a mid-grass prairie that grades in the grasslands around Emporia and Topeka in Kansas. And then finally, when you get past Salina and certainly past Hayes, you grade into another group of grasses called shortgrass prairie. The productivity above the ground is a reflection of the amount of rainfall that you get. So as you go east to west, you do see a decrease in the average rainfall. These grasses are maintained, and you can see the extent of them from Texas into Canada, and the grading of the different colors. The wet edge, shown in purple, the savanna, that maintains some tree growth. And then that darker, what is that, orange? Tall grass prairie, mixed grass prairie is relatively narrowband, and the short grass prairie is extensive right up to the base of the Rocky Mountains. Prairie also is maintained by fire, so the invasive plants, the woody plants, are often killed by the periodic fires, and so the grassland is maintained. We do have examples in Wisconsin, and a periodic burn was necessary. I know people who are, employed in a town or a university often will have a rural home site, and maybe 80 to 100 acres. They discovered that if you want to maintain an open grassland in Missouri or in eastern Kansas, a burn is essential to keep out things like sumac and plum and those kinds of things. There is a tall grass prairie around Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I mention these because they are worth seeing. When you go and see them, you actually, it's more than just a kind of open grassy plain. There are things that you see that come to mind. Oh, that's how that works. Bison are the primary herbivore that are the kind of the climax herbivore of our great open grasslands. There is a Prairie National Park that's established in eastern Kansas, south of Emporia, in a place called the Flint Hills, and they have bison there. They also have a small group of antelope, pronghorn antelope, the southernmost population of those still in existence. So we see here a historical picture of the establishment of the prairie at the University of Wisconsin. And over on the right, the current prairie. This is what the prairie looks like in the wet season, in the spring, where many, many grasses are growing, but all of these herbs, meaning non-woody plants. The purple is liatris, it's called gay feather. And the yellow is Rudbeckia, a coneflower, and the white is the Daucus carota, Queen Anne's lace. All of these herbs pop up, take advantage of the wet soil to reproduce and make seeds, but typically are overcome by the grasses as the drying part of the summer approaches and the grass biomass grows up. So these sometimes these abundance of herbs will die back depending. Wisconsin is an area for grasslands that really actually has quite a bit of water. So the persistence of these herbs will continue even if the flowering is seasonal. Shortgrass prairie, the Great Plains contains really favorable soil for grass cultivation, and so our favorite grass is wheat. And we plant it in acre by acre. When the Ogallala aquifer that I spoke about earlier is discovered, then we pumped it out in unlimited amounts and basically tripled the productivity of wheat. That made us an economic force. The price of wheat is very low because of that abundance, but it is one of our export products. Human population is going to depend on that economic success. When the water runs out in an area, there is nothing for the people to do. And so they typically go to the cities. So we do have situations where farming communities are basically losing population. And I won't go as far as not like mining when the ore runs out and everyone leaves. But the number of people that stay and can make a living goes way down. So the idea, the dream of reintroducing buffalo, there's no prairie to do that unless you have something like the Prairie National Park or the Konza Prairie in eastern Kansas that's associated with Kansas State University. You basically are looking at a large reserve, which has been a very successful approach worldwide. When I was in South Africa, there's a place where volcanic activity had put up a series of hills and volcanic cones, and it was a large area. The volcanoes are now extinct, and it's mainly dry scrubland with seasonal moisture from spring rains. And I mention it because it's about 25 miles across this area, and it wasn't used for very much, so they made it into a national preserve. It's called Pilanesberg Park. Imagine a circle 25 miles across, and they basically did restoration on the plants. They did impound some water, meaning they built dams so that water would collect into ponds and into lakes that would persist through the dry season. They then reintroduced the native wildlife of Africa, and when you go there, you drive around in an automobile on selected roads, but you can see elephant and hippo and rhino. You can see all the antelope. You see zebra. In addition, they recently reintroduced lions. And this is where I went out on an evening. We anesthetized a lion and put a radio collar on it and then watched it recover and walk off into the bush. This is very intense management, but some kind of funny conservation perspectives came out of that visit. I was riding with the chief ranger, and he stopped and he said, look, and there were 3 lions feeding on a sable antelope. And he looked kind of unhappy. And I said, well, what's wrong? Are you upset by the fact that they're feeding on that antelope? He said, well, not the feeding. He said, but there are 3 lions, none of which is worth more than $200. But that sable antelope I can sell for $30,000. So there were some kind of mixed perspectives. One of the successful things about that Pilanesberg Reservation is that there is a commercial value, and they act in their management to recognize what are the valuable species and to support their excess reproduction. And reproduction from that park was seeding sable antelope populations in preserves in Kruger and other vast parks in Africa. Montana is a state that does have extensive grain culture and also extensive cattle and meat animal production. That's a good place to buy up areas. Nature Conservancy bought Matador Ranch and did a trade. If they would allow a lease arrangement with farmers and ranchers if they would protect those species that typically are eliminated. When you move in, you generally go out and exterminate the prairie dogs. They had to be protected. The sage grouse is one that naturally declined as a result of human interaction. Weeds and invasive plants were to be controlled and fire was to be allowed. So as a lease arrangement, nature is maintaining a lot of natural balance, but cattle are still being produced. The American Prairie Foundation is buying land very extensively, and the consideration of the introduction of predators, large kind of apex predators, is one that is gaining momentum in several places. So here's a location along the Missouri River. There's a place called the Missouri Breaks. When you drive across Montana, you'll look across the grassland and it rolls a little in some places. Other places it's very flat. But you'll drive for miles and miles over these rolling hills with nothing but grass or agricultural wheat on other grains on either side. But then all of a sudden you get to the Missouri River Valley. And it's interesting. It's like it opens up at your feet. You drive right up to the edge before you even know it's there. And then there's this huge erosion valley full of water, and there's trees, a riparian strip that's very unusual because of the abundance of groundwater throughout the year. A tremendous place in the Missouri Breaks for you to visit. Here we have the bison on the Shortgrass Prairie. They're basically adapted to live in the climate, which is difficult. Cattle have a difficult time enduring the winter. Their meat can be marketed, although it's not as popular as beef. Beefalo, bison and cattle hybrid is something that is available as well. It's a meat that contains much less fat, although it is a little tougher. It is a stronger taste. It's a great example of using the native species, which is essentially adapted to just turning it loose and letting it go. Wetlands and streams, wow. We have a whole set of stories to tell about wetlands and streams because they typically contain abundant water and when drained produce wonderful home sites and agricultural areas. They're very productive. There's a relatively small percentage of our land that is wetland, but in fact a lot of our endangered species now are in that wetland area. It's been this kind of odd reversal. I mentioned the prairie dog. There were, I should also mention the coyote. There were bounty programs on prairie dogs and coyotes, so you brought them in when you killed them and you got money for them. There were incentives for people to go out and drain wetlands to establish usable land for building and for agriculture. Now we've reversed that, understanding that we have enough variety of possibilities of where we build, and the wetlands are irreplaceable and should be maintained and managed. The Gulf Coast has received a lot of attention because of the conversion of mangrove coastline into a beachfront coastline, and as a result, things like wave action and things like hurricanes are much more destructive. Flooding inland during a hurricane is increased when those natural barriers are removed. The Everglades is a good example of a place that has been basically drained. This wetland is a cypress swamp, it appears. I can't identify it just from looking at it, but this is a typical view you would see in the Everglades. With vast areas of water and very soft substrate, trees growing, as long as that water's moving, trees will grow with great survival capability. And the water and land-based animals that live here are very diverse. The Clean Water Act affected wetlands because wetlands filter and clean water as they flow through. The Farm Bill was in 1985 was noteworthy because we pay agricultural subsidies on any number of crops and products to farmers, but we removed those subsidies or prohibited them if the farmer was damaging wetlands. There is now, in many cases, a recognition of their importance for water management as well as land management. And this no net loss idea is something that is gaining a lot of favor. Generally, if we alter wetlands, there's a sort of interesting, you put on a regulation with an intent, and people develop something that that answers the letter of the law, but violates the intent. So it is possible to divert water movement, water drainage in a wetland, and build a small pond. So that pond basically does not serve the same purpose, but it is within the letter of the law. So I think we have a picture of that coming up. Everglades restoration. We drain the Everglades as a result of the desire of people to live there on the south tip of Florida. That whole southern tip of Florida, especially on the western side, is largely unconsolidated sand and shell and rock fragments, gravel. And it's very, very low. In our habitation, as we colonized, 90% of the wading birds of Everglades National Park disappeared, down to 10%, no longer maintained by the natural ecosystem there. Now that resulted from building levees and pumping or draining water to create dry land. And there were a lot of reasons for that. However, the value of wetland was not compared to the value of the agricultural products. In that day, free enterprise, capitalism held sway. And as a result, we have now come full circle realizing the value of the wetland, not just for tourism, but for environmental quality, and more restoration projects are being successful. You can see here the progress, the historic flow of the water through southern Florida and out to the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. Those regions were diverted to create land, and you can see the shrinkage of it in the center current flow model, and the planned flow as we restore more of that natural flow in through that, especially that southwestern tip. Chesapeake Bay, what a remarkable place, a huge estuary which has tidal variations and salty water. Estuary mixes fresh water and salt water on a regular basis and had tremendous productivity and biodiversity. It was a wonderful wintering ground for waterfowl. But as a result of the development around it, beginning at its lower extent with Baltimore, Maryland, and as you move up Philadelphia, and as you move up to the top of Delaware, there's a city in Delaware that's right on the border. And then the peninsulas on the other side are very attractive for human habitation. So huge populations grew up around it. It suffers from damage at the bottom. Look at that. Everything on the list that's possible affects the Chesapeake Bay. Sediment, the physical factor of sediment was also an important factor in changing the biodiversity. This is one of those things where crabs and oysters and estuary fish, those that can tolerate fresh and saltwater mixtures, were an abundant source of everything from food to materials. Those things are dramatically changed in the Chesapeake Bay. When you want to look for a place where there's a tremendous political fight, a tremendous division of opinion, science and social. What should our view for the Chesapeake Bay be? The Chesapeake Bay would be the place to look. So I'm going to, and I recognize we've gone on a long time here and gotten through a good part of the material. So I am going to do a couple of things, stop the recording,